I don't think he knows who I am, but he recognises me. So when I go in, normally he's just sitting in a chair like this, either half asleep or just staring into space, and then he'll look at me and he'll go, oh. And sadly, dementia, Alzheimer's, those rates are increasing at quite a frightening rate. And later on, in a similar way, trying to get advice, it was, well, you're self-funding, we can't give you advice. So this episode, I'm going to talk about dementia. A few weeks ago, I put out a post regarding my dad, who is currently in a dementia care home, and it got a really, really good response. Lots of people went to the Livedinsights website and filled in a questionnaire with their experience of people they know, family members, parents with dementia. And we haven't talked about that on the podcast yet. So I thought I would do this one, talking about the experience that I've had over the last few years regarding my dad. This Livedinsights podcast is all about dementia.
Okay.
So, hello again, Greg.
Hello again. We find ourselves here again.
I think it's better rather than just myself on the we'll have you giving me some questions.
Chime in a little bit, and
yeah,
like I always said off camera, my granddad's got dementia and Alzheimer's as well, so we might be able to, have some interesting.
I mean, feel free to mention about him and that situation, and I'm sure there will be some similarities. I mean, I think everyone's situation, like with most things, is unique. There different circumstances, situations, but there's going to be a lot of commonalities, and a lot of things. I mean, so much I've learned over the last few years. I had no knowledge whatsoever, and the amount I've learned, a real eye-opener in many ways. And sadly, dementia, Alzheimer's, those rates are increasing at quite a frightening rate. And there's probably some reasons for that, that probably we won't go into on this podcast, but there's undeniably the rates are increasing. And so whether it's grandparents, whether it's parents, whether it's people themselves, it's going to affect a huge amount of people, a high percentage of people. It affects them now, it's going to affect them in the future. So hopefully from this podcast, sharing my experiences and perhaps your own, that can be beneficial. And I certainly wish I knew a lot of what I now know a few years ago, because it would have helped enormously.
So could you talk us through some of the learnings that you've...
Yeah, so I mean, my dad, he's 80 now, and it was back in about 2020, 2021, when it became apparent that he wasn't, up here, he was forgetting things, and, you don't know whether that's just old age or whether it's something more. And obviously at that time, COVID was happening. And so pre-COVID, he was pretty active. He walked a lot. He was always an intelligent man, and had all his faculties in that sense. And I think COVID, whether it acted as a catalyst, because I think there's an argument to say that being confined to your home and not getting this, perhaps a stimulation from meeting people and going out, could have had an impact, or whether it was just the timing of it. But he certainly went sort of downhill during COVID, though, especially that first year. And I'll be honest, we were never that close. So it wasn't like I saw him all the time. He lived near Kettering. I was up sort of Nottingham. So it was a good, well over an hour and a half away. I didn't see him that often. We had contact, but nothing, weren't particularly close. He had a long-term partner who they didn't live together, but they were close. They lived fairly close to each other. And when we did meet up, there was a few conversations, to suggest that things were not as you'd want them to be. So we were kind of aware, 2020, 2021, that there could be something, more than just a bit of forgetfulness or old age. And it was during the summer of 2021 where a couple of times we'd met up and conversations from his partner were more, he's not right. There's, this isn't how it should be, and we need to start thinking about things like power of attorney. Now, power of attorney, probably a lot of people heard of it. Some people know a lot about it, but most people probably don't have a clue really what that is. And I didn't have much of an idea, to be honest. But fortunately, in October 2021, we arranged my sister, I've got an older sister, who lives down in southeast London, so she's much further away. So it was her, my dad's partner, and myself. We all got together and agreed that we needed to get power of attorney done. And there were two types of power of attorney. There's the financial one and there's the health one. And essentially what it is for the person it applies to, it's them saying that if they lose their faculties, if physically they can't do stuff, mentally they can't do stuff, then somebody is assigned responsibility, and it could be more than one person, to look after their affairs and make decisions on their behalf in their best interests. And I think the reality is most people don't want to think about that, don't want to think about death, don't want to think about not being in a situation where they can't manage their own affairs. And so they put it off, or it's something they'll come to at a later date. And I say fortunately, we started looking at that in October. And the two of them, the financial one is much quicker and easier to do than the health one. There's a lot more to go through and think about with the health one. And we went through the financial one, and it was a struggle. It's not easy, but it doesn't take that long. And it can be quite cheap. You can do it yourself. Go onto the government website, download the forms, fill it all in. You've got to get witnesses, and it's got to be done whilst the person does have all their faculties, does agree. It's their wishes. So if they're not capable, then it's too late. You can't, in retrospect, go and do it.
See, a lot of people wouldn't even.
So if you listen to Martin Lewis, one of the things that he will scream and shout about is get power of attorney done, no matter what age, whether you're 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever age, power of attorney. Talk about getting a will done, but and wills are very important, but a power of attorney is even more important, because if you don't have that in place, and whether it's physically or mentally, you can't do what you want to do, and nobody knows what your wishes are, nobody knows what the situation is, then what's going to happen? Either not a lot's going to happen, or the authorities at some stage will intervene, and it may not be in your best interest. It may not be what your wishes were. So for the sake of, it was £83 or something to do it, and a bit of time and a bit of effort, it's well worth it. So fortunately, we did the financial one in the October 2021. We were going to do the health one, but two things happened. Firstly, my dad was starting to get upset because he was still understood what was happening. And of course, it's not a very nice thing to think about and to go through, and especially with the health one, talking about what he may want or not want and all of that. And it's a longer form. So we kind of said, we'll leave it for now. Don't want to upset him. And then shortly afterwards, I got my cancer diagnosis. And from that point, for months and months and months, I was kind of out of the game. I was
dealing with your own
dealing with all of that. And so, fortunately, we got the financial lasting power of attorney signed and done. And I was nominated as the person, with the power of attorney. So that was done. So that was October 2021. So he was still sort of okay at that stage, but there were signs of issues which the suspicion was it was going to be dementia. He was on that path down that road.
What were those initial
signs?
signs?
It was forgetfulness, repeating things. That's what we saw. His partner saw a bit more, some more of the symptoms or characteristics, or rather things that were out of character. I think she mentioned, for example, going to London on a day trip and him being really, really anxious or didn't want to be there, and a few things like that. And so it was, we could see it when we met him and saw him, but his partner, she saw it more and was saying, look, this needs to be looked at. And also, his mum had dementia.
Right, okay.
My nan. And that kind of felt like, and I mean, I don't know enough, in terms of genetics and are you predisposed to it, or is it completely irrelevant, or, but it just felt, and I think, although he didn't want to talk about it or admit to it, at that stage, I think he was aware that this is likely to be the case. So then we got on to several months where I was completely out of it with my treatment and recovery and everything else. But in the springtime, it was right, we need to get him a diagnosis. We need to get to see him professionals. And that started that whole process. And the way it works, I think, generally is you go to your doctors, you get referred to a memory clinic, and then you go for assessments and tests, and it all takes time. And I remember him getting a phone call, I think it would have been about June, because I was still early days of my recovery, June 2022, from the memory clinic saying we've assessed him and we think he's got dementia. We need to do a CT scan to determine if that's definite and also what type of dementia. So then it was like, okay, this is looking, like it. I mean, I'm having to wait to get a scan done, and that was done in the August. So we had a CT scan in the August, and then it was mid-October. He got the diagnosis, saying yes, it is dementia and it's Alzheimer's. And then it's like, okay, now what? So it's one thing getting a diagnosis, it's then, well, what can be done about it? And he lived on his own. So he had a long-term partner who lived like within a couple of miles, quite close. But he had his own house. He'd lived there since about 1990 or so. He'd lived there 30 odd years. So it was very much his home, very familiar. And the natural instinct was, well, he needs to stay in his own home because that's what he knows. That's his familiar surroundings. It's best to keep him in his own home. But trying to then find out a bit more about dementia and what does this mean, and what help is there, what support, etc. And that's when you first sort of felt, well, what do we do here? He's deteriorating. We know there's really only one way this is going, but what can be done about it? And they talked about giving him some medication, but at that time they had to test his heart in order to see if he was okay with his medication. And actually, his heart came back as there was some issues with his heart. It's like a high heartbeat, and so they had to have a couple of tests with that. And so he wasn't given He was then given medication for his heart, but couldn't take any medication for the Alzheimer's. And this was all kind of manageable at this stage, in that he was still eating himself. He could still kind of look after himself, but more and more often his partner was having to help him. And then she started talking about, I don't think he's safe to drive. And driving for him had always been a big part of his life. As in, I mean, I don't know this, but from what I was told, he was well into his motorbikes and his cars at a very young age. And what I was aware was he, for many, many years, was part of the Advanced Motorist Institute and used to, I think, be chairman of his local, whatever they're called. But yeah, it was like advanced motorist stuff. And he was always, drove a lot and was very proud of being a good driver and all of that. And the fact that, it was mentioned that, he's starting to struggle on certain things, or would say something about the car not working, and it was like, again, warning signs that there's something that's so normal, but he was now struggling, and therefore it's like, well, this is also potentially unsafe. So I remember trying to have a conversation to say that you shouldn't drive anymore, and that being a bit of an issue. But fairly soon, he kind of accepted that, and we took away the keys and basically said you can't drive anymore. And that would have been late 2022, probably the same sort of time as a diagnosis. And we said, no more driving, take away the key, and we basically we sold it fairly soon after, just to make sure. And there wasn't much resistance. So I think he either realised, this is the right thing to do, or he was worse than we thought and didn't really understand. Because, what then happened was quite a sudden, it felt like sudden downhill, shift, big time, where it was about early December, I think, we decided that we should get carers to come in the morning to check that he was awake, got up, and also taking his medication and having breakfast. So we then paid for carers to come in every morning to make sure he was awake and up, had his breakfast and had his medication. And that was a kind of speaking with his partner and just thinking, well, what's the best thing to do? And again, having no knowledge, there was no obvious help or support. You got a diagnosis, okay, we kind of know where this is then going and what it is, but you don't get told anything or any help.
They don't teach these things in school, do they?
And it's like, I don't know anything, so what can you do? And I'm still recovering from cancer and got my business to run, and quite far away, and it was very, very difficult to know what was the best thing to do or the right thing to do. And I remember sort of trying to have appointments with his doctor and trying to get a few things in place. Obviously, I had the power of attorney, started to try and work out, his financial situation. I had no idea. I mean, I knew he owned his house, but in terms of his bank account or savings or pensions or anything like that, I had no idea. But so trying to work all that out is an absolute nightmare. And I'll come on to that in a few minutes. But I hope you're finding this episode interesting, informative and beneficial. And if so, please like, comment, subscribe, follow, and keep watching and listening to future episodes. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your colleagues. Also, if you can, go to the livedinsights.com website and fill in an online questionnaire. You'll be helping so many other people understand more about these different topics and issues. So remember, tune in to Lived Insights, the conversation, and the website. Thank you. Trying to get, I remember initially trying to make sure his doctor knew who I was, and this is what happened. And that was like an initial difficulty, trying to just, because he can't then go to the surgery. He's not in a position now to do what he would normally do. He effectively needs care. And his partner, they weren't married, they won't live together. That became sort of difficult to explain because legally she's nothing, yet she's the closest person by far to him. Me being his son, power of attorney, I was able then to almost insist and say, you have to know this situation and you've got to deal with me now, in terms of what support is there, doctor's advice, the fact that he had this heart thing, what's going to be done about that. So yeah, it was just kind of trying to work out everything, what to do for the best. And say we got the carers in, we all felt, okay, this is good, having them come in once a day. And they started to think about perhaps they need to come in the afternoon as well, and started to try and find out, is there charities that could help with this? Because the carers are expensive. So it was kind of, well, yeah, what's best here? And it was over that Christmas period, trying to work out what to do. And we said to the carers, like, can you come in maybe 2 or 3 times a week in the afternoon? And we just got that in place, just to check. But things were, going downhill quite quickly. And Christmas period, it was like just trying to understand what to do. It was really, really tough. And then I remember it was just into the new year, getting a phone call at 4:00 in the morning from a unknown number. Thinking, is this some, what? And I kind of, do I answer it or not? Okay, I'll answer it, thinking it's some, well, I won't say it on here, but I wasn't very happy being woken up at 4 o'clock. Anyway,
not ideal.
It was a police officer, a lady, phoned up to say that they had, basically my dad had been found at a bus stop, fairly close to his home, and basically they were kind of telling me that they found him and he was now at home, but he's on his own. And so that was all like, well, thanks very much. My God, what's happened here? And thank you. On the other hand, they were like, what the hell is this person who's clearly not fit to be on his own doing? Why is he on his own? Almost like having a go at me. And I'm like, because what happened, he'd gone out very late at night, and a neighbour, fortunately, had seen him go out at about midnight or something, or 1 o'clock in the morning, something very, very late. They happened to be up. And then they were a bit concerned. And so they tried to find him, but they couldn't find him, and knew that he wasn't back at home. And so they called the police, and then the police found him about a mile or so away at a bus stop. And what all this was about was he no longer realised that that was his house. He was trying to get somewhere else. So this is what often happens. They don't know where they are. They don't recognise that that's where they live, their home, and they're trying to get to another place. And it happened to be a freezing cold January, middle of the night. Not only could it be really dangerous in terms of being attacked or mugged or something, the cold. I mean, I think he was in his pyjamas but had a coat on, and luckily he had his wallet in his coat which had the address, and then they were able to get back. And I don't remember exact details, whether he had his keys on him or it probably did, so they got it in. But it was just like, oh my God, what, he can no longer be on his own. Yeah. So, obviously, fortunately, he was, taken back inside and at home. But the police were kind of like, they were understandably like, why is he on his own? This is ridiculous. He can't be on his own. But we didn't know. No idea it was this
you only
bad.
Found out.
Yeah.
There and then.
And so, essentially, myself and my sister, we shared a few days where we went and lived with him, and it became apparent straight away that it got very bad in the sense that he no longer knew it was his home, and he was fixated on getting out. And so, for example, go there and he'd be trying to get out and go somewhere, and be like trying to talk to him, and he wouldn't be listening. And so I had to make sure the doors were locked and taking the keys, but also the windows. So he started trying to get out through the windows. So then it's like trying to lock all the windows, the doors, making sure everything was locked so he couldn't get out. And then what he would do is be up all night, like around the house, like either looking for things or fidgeting or...
My granddad was the same.
Yeah.
He'd always be looking for his wallet.
Yeah, and looking for drawers and putting things here. And I remember I was like staying in the spare room, and I couldn't sleep at all, because what would happen is every hour or so, you'd get the door would open, he'd look in, and then he'd close it, and you're like, what's going on? And you're trying to get him back to sleep, but he wouldn't. And I think it's something called sundowning. I think that's what they call it, where they don't understand time anymore. They don't understand it's their house. They don't understand the time, and therefore their sleep completely goes. And yeah, I mean, I spent a week there. It was a mix of. It was really upsetting. It was emotionally draining, because you're like, what is going on? What can I do? How has this happened? What's best for him? And then there's the practicalities of, well, I can't live here for indefinitely. What can we do? What's the answers? What is the best thing to do? And the fact that he's not sleeping and I'm not sleeping, he doesn't really recognise me, he's not listening, he doesn't know that it's his house, and this seemingly all came very, very quickly. So then we said, well, we've got to bring in carers full time, because there was still this sense of this is the best place for him, his home, but then there was the realisation that he needed full-time care. And actually, now that he doesn't realise that it's his home, that doesn't make it's not so essential that he stays there.
Got you.
So we agreed that we'd get full-time carers in, which meant basically someone had to live there. Now, the cost of that is, ridiculous, but it was the only option at that stage, because he wasn't safe. He was trying to get out, he wasn't eating unless you put food in front of him. He'd eat. He could eat if you put it in front of him, and then he'd eat it, but otherwise he wouldn't have eaten anything. He wasn't looking after himself.
Yeah.
It was
probably need help showering, things like that.
Yeah, another thing, another big symptom is not taking personal care of yourself. So stopping showering, or wearing the appropriate clothing, all these things, and it seemingly happened so quickly. But we managed to, with the company we were using for the carers before, they had somebody who could start pretty quickly who came and lived in. And it was astronomical costs, but it was like, well, we have no choice. I can't live here indefinitely, and also I'm not a carer. I'm not. They've got much better skills and knowledge than me. And so we decided. Well, we had the carer in full time, and we're paying for that. And then it was like, well, what do we do? And I was speaking to my sister, and as I mentioned, she was a long way away, and also speaking to his partner, just to try to understand, what are the options and what could we do. And it was kind of agreed that he needed a care home. He needed somewhere, who could properly look after him. And then it was kind of agreed that it was best to have somewhere near me. You know, I was a power of attorney. I was, it was just more practical to look for care homes near where I lived in Nottingham. And from his partner's point of view, I mean, very, very, very difficult for her because she'd seen this close up for the last couple of years. So she'd been obviously the person closest to him and had gone through, and it had taken a real burden for her, emotionally having to deal with this and see who, the person she loved deteriorating like this. And although, in some ways it might have made sense for her to look for care homes near where they lived, I understand the reasoning for that. I mean, I think the best way of explaining this in some ways is she'd already lost him, as in he'd already gone, where he wasn't him, and he didn't even know her.
Right.
Again, it's really hard really because I wasn't close to her, and all this stuff happening. You wouldn't know what's done for the best. You can appreciate how heartbreaking it must be for her and difficult, and trying to make the right decisions. But the decision was made to look for care homes near where I was, and then it was a case of, right, well, where do I start? It's like Googling care homes, and it's dementia or Alzheimer's, so you sort of put in this, and
this is going on while you're.
Oh yeah. I mean,
cancer diagnosis.
Still this. So this was the January of 2023. Yeah, January 2023. So this is before I get re-diagnosed, and but still, recovering, still dealing with everything. My daughter, the business, all of this stuff, and it was all unknown. I didn't know anything about care homes. What I found out very quickly was they're incredibly expensive, and this is a whole nother conversation. My dad, because he had his own house, not worth that much, but worth enough, and he had some savings. Basically, everything had to be self-funded. So, I'll touch on it now then. So, with being the power of attorney, I was trying to find out about his situation. So I had to find out, I knew he'd owned his own house, and I'd assumed he'd paid off the mortgage, and he had, and I knew roughly the value of the house. Then I had to find out his bank account, and I had to then have meetings and trying to power of attorney documents, because most places you have to have the original or a certified copy of the power of attorney to prove who you are and everything, which is understandable, but it's very, very long-winded. And the amount of times I had to basically go down the bereavement route to get anyone to answer the phone or to contact, because it's very little access or to let people know how to deal with this. Because so his bank account, eventually his main ones were like with Barclays, and I had to go down to Kettering and fill in lots of forms and do all these things. And then I got access to his bank accounts, and I sort of saw that, and then I found out he'd got an ISA here, and he'd got a bit of savings here, he'd got a couple of shares here, and it was just like, nightmare, because he'd had not a huge amount of money, but scattered all about in different places. And each one you had to like register the power of attorney and contact them and tell them who you are and what's happened and try and work out. And
sounds stressful.
It's so time consuming, stressful, but it's time consuming. And then some things were quicker than others, and it's horrendous. So anybody who might be going down that route, especially if you're an elderly person, and you know, try to make it as easy as possible for your children or the power of attorneys to find out where things are. Have a document, have somewhere where everything is, because I was having to go through all sorts of files and stuff trying to work out and he had about 4 different bank accounts, a couple of ISA bonds and various different shares. None of this was worth that much money, but it was all bits here, bits there, and kind of worked out overall that he'd had this, and then I got his pension, he'd got his state pension, and he'd got a couple of private pensions coming in, and it's all of this stuff. It takes forever. So time consuming and difficult and long-winded. So having to manage all of that. And then it was the care homes, and I went to about 4 or 5 different ones, and I'd never been to a care home before. And what I guess shocked me.
What did you think of it?
Sorry?
What did you think of it? First impressions?
I was not sure what the best word. Depressed. Mainly because, and this is going to sound terrible, but they smelt.
There is a smell, isn't there?
Smell, and you go in and there's a whole mix of people there for different reasons, and a lot of the time you've got people just slumped in their chairs, just existing, but just slumped in their chair. You've got people screaming, shouting. You got a whole mix, and that was my overwhelming impression. The first 3 or 4 I went to was, this is so depressing, and my poor dad is going to have to go into one of these places, and it smells, it's noisy, it's depressing. You just see, and it was a real eye opener. But I also knew I had to find somewhere, and that even these, I wasn't going to the really terrible ones. I was going to ones that had good ratings, and then you find out the cost, and they're like 60 grand a year, and you're thinking, he's now someone who's worked all his life, has very proud of owning his own home, and before he got the diagnosis now, I remember him saying how proud he was that he's going to leave his home to his son and daughter. He was he's proud that he'd something to pass on. This was his home, and he was going to pass it on to his son. And he had a little bit of savings here and there and stuff. And it was like this is all going to go. 60 grand a year is going to go. Because I remember asking the dementia consultant, the main person with the memory clinic who gave the diagnosis, and I said to him, how long has he got? And he said, well, the stage he's at, typically maybe 4 years, but because of actually he's in very good physical health, you're probably looking at another 2 or 3 years beyond that. So then it's so we've got quite a lot of years, and I'm pretty good with numbers, and you could work out quite quickly that was all going to go. So basically, through no fault of his own, as much as we're aware in terms of the dementia, certainly in his case, through no fault of his own, got this disease. He'd worked all his life, never taken anything. He'd worked hard. He'd been diligent. He'd saved up and all this stuff. And now he's going to basically spend the last several years of his life in a horrible, what I thought was going to be a horrible kind of care home in a little room, not knowing anything, and all his money was just going to go, including his house. And I'll be honest, there was a bit of me that was kind of, that money or that house was going to be half mine with my sister, and I'm just being honest, and that's all going to go as well. And this is just a horrible situation for him and for everybody else. Like,
it's a lot of money, isn't it?
and yeah, and how is it this expensive? It's like, it's not a 5-star hotel with, and so it was a very depressing situation on many levels and emotionally draining. But at the forefront, it was like, what is the best thing to do for him? And I remember having conversations with the memory clinic and people trying to say, well, what's best? What do we do? I don't know anything about this. And there was literally no advice because, and later on, in a similar way, trying to get advice, it was, well, you're self-funding. We can't give you advice. And again, I can only speak from my own experience, but there's self-funding or there's authority funding. And if it goes through the authorities, then you're in that system where they're allowed to give advice because effectively they're paying for it, they're looking after it, you're in the system. So the dementia specialists, the nurses, the people who know about it, they can offer advice and what's best. But if you're not, they can't in case they get sued or...
So why would a certain... What's the difference? Like, how can someone go through the authority route? Because they don't own a home, they have no
savings.
choice
I think
whatsoever.
I think the level is something like £22,500 of savings. If you're below that, or assets, savings assets. So if you've not got a house and you've not got more than £23,000 savings, then everything's paid for because you can't afford it. If you've got above that, then you pay for it until you can't afford it, until your level drops. So my understanding was, in my dad's case, he'd have to pay until, and including selling the house, until it got to the roughly 23,000 figure. At that point, he can no longer afford it. So that was the situation. It's like, I've got to find a care home. It's going to cost this amount. All this money is going to go. It's a horrible situation, but that seems to be the only option. And as I say, I looked at lots of different care homes, but we had to make a decision as quickly as possible. Anyway, I found one quite close to me that had good ratings, went around it, and it felt, it still smelled and it still wasn't great, but it was a bit better, and they had a room available. Because a lot of them don't have rooms available. These places are packed out. So, I mean, there's retirement homes and care homes being built all the time because there's such a demand for it. And so there was this place near me and a bed was available, and they went through they don't just take any old person. They went through some reports and assessment effectively, and they said, yeah, we can take him. It's like, right, big relief, he's going in. And it was February the 14th, Valentine's Day 2023, so just over 2 years ago. I had to go down, couldn't tell him, I mean he wouldn't know anyway, but couldn't tell him, and literally just said, we're going to go for a drive, got some of his belongings in the car, drove him up to Nottingham. Is this your new home? Or didn't tell him that, he wouldn't understand, but I moved him into this care home. And it was, it was horrible, it was emotional, it was, but at the same time, it was like, this is the right thing for him, and this is really the only option. Don't know any other options really, but this is... So he moved into this care home, and that was February the 14th, and he lasted there until July. And the reason why he moved out in July was essentially because it wasn't a dementia care home, and there was various issues. That was mainly because some of the carers are brilliant, but some of the carers didn't know how to deal with it.
Specialist
So
area of care.
There was a few incidents. Without going into too much detail, he was on this corridor, and the rooms were okay, quite nice, fine. And there was, I think it's about 7 rooms along the corridor. he was the only male, and there were 6 other females on this corridor. This was like the dementia level. On the first level, because it's harder for them to escape and get out. Because people will try to get out. I don't want to be here, or they want to get home when they go out. Don't know where they are. So so it's on the first floor on this corridor. I think it was 7 rooms, 6 other women. So the two main issues were he kept going into other people's rooms, and because they were female, wasn't appropriate. And a couple of times he'd been found in a room just with another female on their own. Not aware, nothing happening, but it's, we can't have that happening. It's like, well, wait a minute, you put him on this corridor, it's all open doors.
Yeah, he'd probably just try to find his room.
It was like he was a bit of company, bit of fine. I don't know. I don't think it was anything. There's nothing.
Yeah.
But that couldn't happen. It was inappropriate, etc. And then there was a couple of times we lashed out at a carer, and it was like, well, he's not that sort of person, and there must be a reason for this. And it later transpired that effectively, there's 2 ways of handling someone, I guess. If you want them to sit down and eat their food, you can encourage them, speak to them, show them, gently, try to get them there, or just let them be, don't push it. Or there's physically trying to force someone down into a seat. And what seems to have happened was the latter was used by a couple of the carers, and I'm not going to blame them. It's just they weren't trained in dementia, and he lashed out because he was being physically pushed down. It's kind of understandable that he might lash out, and I don't know the full details, but there was like a couple of reports that he'd lashed out and a care, and then obviously that's that can't be happening. But we were getting it was a case of, I was never particularly happy with the care home. They seemed to be like phoning up saying, oh, there's another incident, there's another issue, and you're like, well, what am I supposed to do about it? I'm you're the care home, and also you're the ones that on your website say dementia this, dementia that, and what later transpired was there's a difference between specialist dementia care, or with trained dementia carers, and care homes that are allowed to say or take people with dementia. There's a big difference, and people need to be aware of this, because essentially he had dementia, and they were and characteristics that go with that, and some of the carers didn't have the specialist knowledge or care to deal with that, and situations happened, and it was kind of agreed. We had various conversations with the care home. At this point, it was like, well, wait a minute, we're paying like 60 grand a year, and you can't even look after him, and you say you can because look at your website, what it says here, and you took him on and said you could, but then they're saying, oh, we can't deal with him, he needs to go elsewhere, and it was this back and forth. And then it was like, okay, well, let's look into specialist dementia care homes. And then it was like, whoa.
I imagine it's double the price.
Well, not double, but it's like 80 grand. Suddenly it's like 80 grand now that we're going to have to pay for. So it's bad enough at 60 grand. Now it's 80 grand. But we had no choice, because that care home said he needs to go, and we wanted the best place for him. So we found somewhere. And at the same time, and this is something else, no one had ever mentioned this before. And I remember during this period, I was trying to get the right advice, trying to speak to the authorities and the dementia nurses and all this. And they kept saying, we can't offer advice because you're not. And you're like, well, who can? It's like, well, you're self-funded, so you've got to go and find it yourself. And anyway, it got to a point where someone had suggested, I can't even remember what it was called, but doing an assessment. And I can't remember exactly now what it was called or whatever, but it was essentially, if he passed is the wrong word, but if he scored highly enough, he would then go into the system and get self-funding. But there's all this criteria, different elements about whether it's certain behaviours, his physical condition, his mental condition, anything else. And up to that point, it had never been mentioned. And then somebody had said, oh, I doubt he'll get that. And then someone else said, well, he might well get it. Anyway, ended up going down that route. And to cut a long story short, he then passed or got enough points on this assessment, mainly because of the bad behaviour or the inappropriate behaviour, to score, which meant that he was now able to access full funding and get the authority. And it was like, what? This is ridiculous. So because of, it was all kind of, I still think this is absolute madness. But now we were told it'd be initial 3 months and then it'd get assessed again. So we found him a place at a specialist dementia care home, went there, and now he was getting it all paid for. And you're like, well, there's no in between. Yeah. And it was, yeah. But we were like, well, okay, well, fine, if that's how it is. And then after 3 months, it got assessed again. He goes, yeah, you got full funding for the next year because if he met the criteria. And he was going obviously downhill. You don't get better with dementia. Yeah. He just gets worse at whatever rate.
Was he coping better in that?
So he then, because he was now in a place which was specialist, 2 things. One was had people that understood and could deal with him and manage him appropriately, and so there were no issues then, but he was going downhill in the sense that you couldn't get any sense out of him. He'd talk absolute gibberish, no idea what he was talking about. He would not be able to stop dressing himself and doing things for himself. So he was no longer any kind of independence, and he'd only eat if you put it in front of him. So he was going downhill from the dementia, but his behaviour had improved, and it was all a bit calmer. And from my point of view, having spent all this time like back and forth with the care homes, what's to do best? This isn't happening. Why can't I get the support? What about the advice? What should I do? I have no idea. All this stuff. It was like a real weight had been lifted off my shoulders because I knew that he was in the right place now. And I didn't have to go and see him like every 2 days, So I was like, right, I've got my own issues to deal with. Remember, this is when I had second diagnosis, surgery, just doing, I had a lot going on in my life. And so he went in the July 2023 into the specialist dementia care home. And of course, still having to see him, every week or every couple of weeks and various things. But there was this sense of he's in the right place now. No matter what, they know better than me. Whereas it kind of felt the previous one that I knew more than they did. And so that was a big turning point in that I could relax a bit, not have so much stress, because I knew that he was in the right place. And there was an element of, this is being funded now as well. Because I think, again, it's only natural. If you're paying 80 grand a year, or it's his hard-earned money over his lifetime, he's paying for this. You want a good service.
Yeah, that's it.
And any little thing, you're kind of like, this isn't right. Yeah. This isn't fair. This is. Whereas now it's like, still want it to be the best service, but it's like, okay, I'm not going to get so wound up. I'm just going to recognise that he's in the right place. The carers know what they're doing. Of course, there's going to be things you think could be done better or whatever, but
they work hard, don't they?
But carers? Yeah, I mean,
long hours.
And I mean, he's in the right place now. So, I'll see him at least every couple of weeks, but I don't spend that long because it's almost like not much point. I mean, I'm fairly close by. I mean, if people are coming from a long way, it makes sense to spend longer, but I don't spend long because he won't remember. He still, I don't think he knows who I am, but he recognises me. So when I go in, normally he's just sitting in a chair like this, either half asleep or just staring into space, and then he'll look at me and he'll go, oh. So he'll recognise me, but I don't think he knows who I am. He just knows that he's someone he knows. So that's where he is now. I mean, physically, he's in good shape. So who knows how long he's got, and it's so sad because, I mean, it's
watching your own dad deteriorate. It's not easy.
It feels like such a waste in so many ways, but anyway, he's in the best place, and all that stress that went on, sort of the diagnosis for him, the initial care, how he went downhill so quickly, the care homes, etc. There's a relief that he's in the right place now. I'm sure there's some more twists and turns to come, but he's okay there. I mean, he turned 80 last summer, so it's not a bad innings. He's always a big fan of cricket. So from that respect, it's a decent innings. But whether he's got a couple of years left, 4 or 5, who knows? But we'll see. But for anybody out there, I had no knowledge prior to this. So what I would say, the big things to be aware of are the power of attorney. Get those sorted as early as possible, as quickly as possible. Get them sorted. It will make a big difference. It will still be a massive headache, depending on their situation, and trying to register you as the power of attorney on all these different banks or accounts or whatever it might be. Get an early diagnosis if you can. The dementia, it takes a long time. Find out where it is in your area, the memory clinics, the assessments. In terms of just being aware of the costs involved, how much it is for these care homes, and depending on your situation, if you knew beforehand, there's a lot of things you can do to plan around the financial side, so that you're not, whether it's, there's all sorts of things you can do. I would speak to a financial advisor if you think this might happen in the future, to get financial affairs in order, and to just to be aware of that. And there's things like annuities you could get to cover costs, but just be aware it's very, very expensive. And if it is dementia, then you're likely to need a specialist dementia care home, nursing care home, and understanding all about that, it's really difficult. There's a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of stuff you just won't know about, and it will probably surprise you.
Well, I'm glad you've said, because I had no idea beforehand, and now I know my granddad's only got so many months left of being able to stay in his home, but okay, maybe it's looking for a dementia specialist care home.
And so there's all the practicalities, and then there's the emotional side. And as I said before, I wasn't that close to my dad, and if anything, we become closer. Like, it's sort of strange paradox. I've seen him all the last few years. I've seen him very, I've seen him more in the last 3 years than I saw the previous 30 years.
Wow.
And so, the relationship in that sense, or the closeness, has got much closer. In terms of, say, his long-term partner, she does come up and visit him, when she can, but it's so difficult for her. And in her own words, she lost him, a while ago, and that, that's terrible and horrible to sort of think about. But all I can say is, he's in the right place now. It's terrible. It does affect millions of people. So whether it affects you now or will do in the future, hopefully this is the insights that I can share will be helpful and beneficial and make you think about certain things. And yeah, it's just obviously, with Livedinsights, it is all about people with lived experience sharing their knowledge, their experience, their insights to benefit others, because you never know when you might go through something similar, or a friend or a loved one, and having that bit of extra knowledge,
even the smallest insights that you can give, you might consider them small, but for someone that has no idea at all, that can be a really big thing. For one little example, my granddad's dementia, Alzheimer's, has got to a point now where he struggles eating, struggles putting one foot in front of the other. But my mum's told me that if she plays some music and does a little jiggle, he'll start dancing, and with that she can help move him into the other room. And so that, when she told me that, I was like, wow, that's actually
a
really
small little thing, but make
really
a massive
helpful.
So
Well,
I mean, I mentioned that February the 14th was when he first went to a care home, and I put a post up, which now a couple of weeks ago from filming this podcast, and had a huge response, and a lot of people filled in the questionnaire. And given that it wouldn't have gone out to that many people, put it on LinkedIn and Facebook, it shows that it affects a lot of people. And so the more people who can share their stories, they share their experiences, fill in the questionnaires, come and talk about it on podcasts, that's going to raise the level of understanding and therefore benefit. And so hopefully people have found this interesting, informative. I don't wish upon anybody, but it's inevitable for many, many people, sadly, including yourself. So go and get your power of attorneys done, and go and have a look at the results and insights from the questionnaires on the Livedinsights website. And
do you think there's a way to, is there, while you're still younger, is there research that people can be doing to perhaps
try to minimise dementia?
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot more recently, and a lot more research being done around exercise and what you eat and drink and all that, your lifestyle, the effect that has. I mean, I think there's some element of genetics, but it seems to be proven more and more that its lifestyle has a much bigger effect. And then they'll talk about, exercising regularly, eating the right foods and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff out there, and you've got to be careful what to believe and everything else. But more and more research has been done to that, and it does seem that there's a lot more what you can do as an individual to reduce the risk than perhaps people thought previously. They thought, it's inevitable or it's genetic, and I think so I would encourage people just in general, in terms of their health, of which this is part of it, to go and do your research, look into it. And for people who know, people who've been in this certain situation, health is your wealth, basically. And too often we neglect that, and we don't appreciate our health until it's too late, or we've gone through something quite serious. So I think taking some personal responsibility around your health and focusing on that is really important.
Definitely, I think that's a really nice note to end on.
Okay, well, thanks again, Greg. And
thank you, Charlie.
Might get you in a seat one day.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and I, pass on my well wishes to your father.
Appreciate it.